And I would first and foremost like to thank you for making the time to come here today, and giving me your insights, actually, us, because I think there's so much. I've been following your work, not for long, but as much as I have, I think there's so much you offer to the community, and you keep doing that, um, which is it is inspiring.
Thank you for saying that. It's a lot of work,
Yeah,
but I think one part of what keeps sustaining me in doing this work is that there is still work to do. And it's up to all of us to choose to do that work. We sometimes have to take breaks, sometimes have to step away from it. But the more of us that there are doing this work, I think the more it'll benefit the community.
yeah, that's right. Absolutely. It's almost like a collective shift.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah, right. And I would like to introduce you. So, Smriti Nair, she's a psychologist with a passion for simplifying the idea of mental health. She has extensive experience working with children, adolescents, and adults, both in India and in Melbourne, which is just amazing. I think that's great. And a therapist, she's a therapist since 2011. In addition to clinical practice, Smriti has experience working in inclusive and advocacy in education, youth mental health, multiculturalism, family violence, and complex trauma across the private and public health sectors. She is the founder of Unhyphen Psychology, and at Unhyphen Psychology, she has worked with people with multicultural and diverse identities and LGBTIQA+, and neurodiverse communities. Unhyphen is involved with multicultural communities across Victoria, and she has facilitated workshops for community members on parenting, mental health awareness, family violence prevention, and delivers education about culturally sensitive mental health support. I think that's very vital. And committed to intersectionality and collaboration, Smriti's work relies on using an anti-oppression and system-focused lens, and they seek to bring this perspective in the areas of community upliftment, policy analysis, and practice development. She's also the founder of Other Chair, which is a place for migrant and multicultural clinicians in Australia for community consultation and peer supervision. Would really recommend really attending that. I think that's a good place to connect with other clinicians and learn from them. Um,
Thank you. Yeah, I think when I moved here, I found that there was no space like that.
yeah,
So I I started it out of my own need to access a space where I knew I would have culturally affirming and safe supervision
yeah.
from other people who understood the experience or had lived experience themselves and actually knew what they were doing rather than give me advice that, was not culturally affirming, which was my experience in supervision before that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I do remember the first conversation we had. And you're like, I didn't have this, so I started this. This wasn't there, so I started this. And I'm like, that's amazing.
Yes, I seem to have started a lot of things.
Yeah. And that's so good because now people like me are like me being an early career psych. Even though I'm a migrant, there's so many things I don't understand of the let's say first, second generation migrants here. So I think that's a space where I can come and connect and really learn, from different
Absolutely.
perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will add the links to all the resources and the other chair and hyphen everything in the podcast description. I will also be uploading this on YouTube. So even there, so keep
Right.
an eye on that, for the audiences. Today, what we'll be covering is so we'll be covering migration, process, grief, support, and displacement. We'll be covering intergenerational trauma and intersectionality. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so the floor is yours. I'll be mainly listening and asking questions, but yeah, yeah, all yours.
Um, you interestingly, you just mentioned, right, having trouble as a migrant and being a psychologist, and still that being so difficult for you
Yeah,
to navigate the systems. And I think it's really important for us to hold that in mind as well, that our clients don't even have as much knowledge or understanding of the system as we may have. We are forced to engage with certain systems like, getting our registration or going to uni or working in the public sector. But most people out there in the community don't.
Mhm.
And so it is incredibly difficult for them to even know that, for example, psychologists who speak the same language as them actually exist out there. So these are just gaps that no one kind of talks about until and
Yeah.
unless they have to actually experience that, or they're forced to experience that, and then the search begins. But yeah, like I said, that was one of the reasons I started the other chair. I could not find a culturally responsive supervisor who knew what they were talking about or who had the specific skill. Um, and a lot of the supervision is paid. Most of the supervisionary
Yeah.
access is
It is.
paid. And as someone who was um, on a highly reduced income because of the kind of work I had to do as a professional psychologist. I was working in a low income kind of clinic, so they worked with a lot of clients who could not afford to pay out of pocket fees, and I was volunteering my time there. So I was not getting paid for that work, and then I had to pay for supervision out of pocket.
Mhm.
And I was just thinking, there's got to be others like me experiencing the same thing. And we have prior work experience, we have lived experience of migration. Some of us have lived experience of mental illness ourselves, and the resilience and grit and the trauma, the knowledge, the cultural understanding that we have is so valuable, which is also one of the reasons I have kept participation and access to the other chair free all
Yeah.
this
Oh,
time.
yeah.
It has always been free for the last 3 years, and I'm hoping to always keep it free because there are so many people out there who would require that support and require that community. I've had a lot of people who are clinicians themselves and who work in communities who come to the other chair and say, for the first time, I'm able to ask questions and I don't feel like I will get judged for them.
Wow.
I feel like I can ask these questions in supervision. I can ask these questions of my peers, and I can share my clients' stories, knowing that these stories will be respected, knowing that my knowledge will be respected. I can share all the knowledge I have that I don't feel comfortable enough sharing in other group supervision sessions. So yeah, it's an honor to be able to provide that to other clinicians as well. And it's also fun because I get to hang out with a lot of really great people every month and talk to them, and we share a lot of knowledge, stories, things that help each other.
Yeah. And you're right. I think the whole process of migration, it is, even though it's such a shared experience, it is so isolating, which is
Yes.
very fascinating. And I feel like this is what I learned through migration, and I think it's a bit transferable even as a being a psychologist. I feel it's a very isolating profession in
Mm-hmm.
general. So like staying connected with other psychologists is so important, whether it's supervision or peer supervision. But in saying that, there's so many resources out there in terms of migration. It's fascinating that not a lot of people know about it, and there's not a lot of awareness about it at all. um, is I didn't know until my third year of uni that there was free counseling available in uni. And I
And
could have used it every year if I knew that. I didn't know that. And just simple things like that, that you can seek support if you have a flatmate, for example, that's abusive in any way.
mm,
You
mm,
can seek support, but there's
mm-hmm.
so much stigma and fear around it.
Oh, absolutely. Stigma is present. Unfortunately, there is fear. And, something that I think a lot of people miss out on, and this actually increases the burden on migrants, is that a lot of people migrate from countries where these systems do not exist,
True.
where, being a therapist is just plainly not a profession that exists. They don't go to a profession to talk about their professional to talk about their problems, or they do not know that there is support available for experiencing domestic violence, or there is no system called child protection in certain countries. There are no policies or systems or public resources in the mental health sphere in a lot of places. People haven't grown up experiencing those supports and experiencing access to those resources. So it's very difficult to move to a new country and just assume that they know all of this, because they don't. They don't have access they haven't had access to that. a lot of it can feel overwhelming. A lot of people worry. A big part of that fear is the fact that they're afraid it'll be connected to their visa status in
Yeah.
some way. You know, if
Yeah.
you're an international student or if you come here on a temporary visa, dependent visa, people worry about how this might reflect on that and how this might reflect on their future applications. People worry about whether this will go back to their employer. Some of them
Mm,
have really precarious employment situations. Some
mm.
of them might be, getting paid in cash in hand jobs, and they might be really afraid that they might lose their only access to income if they seek mental health support and somehow their employer finds out about it. These concepts are widespread in
Mm,
many other places in the world,
yeah.
that your employer stigmatizes you or kicks you out of work if they find
Mm.
out you have a mental illness, or you get socially ostracized if you have a mental illness or you experience something that other people don't agree with. It's really hard for people to just leave alone all those beliefs and values and then move to a different country and just imagine that suddenly all of these supports will be available for them.
That's
And
actually very fascinating.
yeah,
It's a different approach because it sounds like it's not it is not normalized, especially like I come from India. It is not normalized. I think now it's opening up. Now there's space. There are more psychologists who are training, but when I came 8 years ago, it wasn't the case, and I can't
yeah.
imagine for other migrants. But this is very fascinating. So, if you were to look at it from this perspective, how do you think we can challenge it? Not only as not taking the burden as a professional, but if I had to, along with the community, like what are your thoughts on challenging this? Where does the responsibility lie?
I agree with you that the
Mm,
responsibility shouldn't lie on individual professionals
mm,
because these are systemic issues.
mm,
And there are some shifts you can create. You can educate the community around you. You can educate your clients, perhaps. Perhaps you can educate your family members and create some awareness, but you cannot create systemic shifts as one single individual who's also working full time. Let's be real, that's incredibly
yeah,
hard to do.
yeah,
A lot of that responsibility should actually lie with the systems that we are trying to expand, that we are trying to change. When a migrant or an asylum seeker lands here in this country, they should be able to access these resources in a language that they actually understand, and there should be visibility for these resources. And thankfully, now there are a lot of resources available, especially in the area of health, maybe not mental health specifically, but health and family
yeah.
violence. And I say this with so much confidence because I've worked very closely with a few organizations who are doing that work. So these resources are out there, and my biggest gripe about this with the organizations I've consulted with is that there is still extremely limited visibility, because the methods of reaching migrant populations, asylum seeker populations, people who move here, people who use another language, is that you need to access the same modes of communication and information sharing that they are accessing. Putting it up on, for example, sharing health resources on Instagram, when perhaps one particular language speaking community does not actually use Instagram. They use
Yeah.
more of WhatsApp, and you're busy pushing out resources on Instagram that community is never going to access. So you need to engage leaders from communities. That is one of the most important things to do. And we have more and more emerging leaders in multicultural communities, in migrant communities. I think there are a lot of international students leading the charge, and they have a lot of access to resources. They have access to wider communities as well. And there are quite a few leaders in different communities who migrated a while ago and have
Mm,
established networks here or have been working within these systems themselves.
mm.
So we need to really get them also engaged. It has to be multiple people, multiple systems taking responsibility for this, and pushing out that visibility and pushing out the access to information is really, really important. We need to keep this conversation open, and it has to be talked about over and over again. We are not going to get anywhere without having that multi way communication. So even you and I talking, and then you putting this out there as a podcast, is going to reach someone out there who's going to learn a few new things today. And that is going to be helpful.
That's so true. Yeah, it's just I'm processing it, but yeah, I think that that makes a lot of sense. And also, like the way you said it, using modalities that the community uses, that's in a way, I guess, helping them integrate within the society, which is so important for the existing society, right? And it's fascinating because yeah, you're right, like a lot of the methods of communication is probably based on what the existing society uses, not applicable to the one that's migrating. And I guess somewhere you can also use religious platforms because if that's the case. And
Mm.
I have not noticed so much of that happening either. It's very much you're integrating into our society, not, you know, it's sort of the other society is also integrating, which is actually happening, right?
Very true. Yeah, that kind of intergenerational cultural dissonance is
Yeah,
very prevalent.
yeah,
And there are also people who've, say, moved away, for example, from you and I both migrated from India. And there would have been people who migrated from India in the 1980s and wouldn't
yeah,
have realized that India is not the same country it was back then. And that so many changes have happened, and that Indian psychologists exist now in Australia. So they might not even know that that is actually happening. Whereas that integration that you spoke about, that acculturative stress or the pressure to assimilate into an existing
mm,
society is
mm,
huge for new migrants.
mm,
They stand the risk of already having left behind the people they know, their social networks, their family networks, and then coming into a new place, coming in to meet new people, oftentimes without actually knowing anyone here. That was the case for me.
yeah, me too.
Yeah, I came here, without knowing anybody else, and you have to make friends as an adult, which is hard enough. But also you have to learn all these new ways of speaking and moving through society, and the employment here or going to university here, the way of doing things is different. And you're probably also experiencing the grief of leaving behind everything that you have left behind in your home country, whether that was by choice or not. And for some people, especially when we've actively made the choice to migrate, it can be very hard to label that grief. You can experience a lot of shame that, you're actually grieving what you left behind, or that somehow you're not keeping up with the process of assimilation and that you're falling behind and that you will be socially ostracized because you're not assimilating well enough or integrating well enough into this new culture you moved into the new society. And people respond to shame in different ways. People respond to grief in different ways. And some people might overcompensate and, try their hardest to assimilate into this new culture. Some people might just disintegrate at the thought of it and realize that they can't actually take any more of this pressure and then isolate themselves.
Mm,
Things become harder for them. It
mm,
can be a process that creates a lot of resentment and sadness as
mm,
well.
mm.
So these processes can look so different for different people, but unless they access a space where they are safe enough to talk about this, they're not going to be talking about it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And also another thing is just normalizing this experience in itself. I don't think I've met one individual who's migrated, who's been like, oh yep, I'm so comfortable with this. It's
Mm.
just it's a very difficult process, and it's very it's not spoken about much. People don't speak about it because it is a difficult process, because it's so personal.
Mm. It is very personal. It is the way each person reacts to this is so different, and perhaps not, they might not always be comfortable talking about it. There may be unresolved issues in the process of migration for them. For some people, it might be quite easy. And then they might end up thinking, like, oh, is it that, am I doing something wrong? Why is this so easy for me? Or if some people who experience migration and it's really easy for them to integrate, they might actually get shunned by their other people in their community who might think, oh, well, you're a sellout. You, you've changed. You're not like us anymore. There are risks everywhere,
Mm,
socially and psychologically speaking.
mm,
It is actually a really risky process.
mm, mm. So just let's say there's a mic. Let's, for example, I'll talk about my experience when I was trying to, I would actually use the word fit in because I was trying to fit in,
Mm,
um, because that was a coping mechanism. But I found it easier to do some things such as focusing on my education, which that was the main purpose. I think that worked really well as a distraction for me,
mm,
and communicating, sorry, and connecting with people like me
mm.
really helped. Not necessarily having the same experience as me, but just from a very values based perspective.
Yes.
The things they valued and I valued really, and I think that was, it helped me just feel comfortable in my space. I created a space for me in a very new country,
Mm,
and I think that's, if I were to go through another process of migration again, I don't want to, if I had to, it would be finding, even if it's a couple of people who you can connect with, to based on a values perspective, who actually make you feel psychologically safe while you're
absolutely.
processing. Sometimes it takes years to process this, it's always a process, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but we know that when people are aligned with their values, they feel safer, they feel more authentic. It just makes life easier in general. But finding those people with the same values is the difficult part. A
Yeah.
lot of people tend to believe that just because you're from the same country, or just because you're from the same culture, or just because you speak the same language, your values will automatically match. And that's not always the case.
That's a big misconception. That's a
Yeah.
big misconception. And I had that when I migrated. I thought, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to get along with every other Indian that's there in Australia," but that is not the case. Absolutely.
Not
Because
at
it's just
all.
not. Yeah, we're so multicultural, even in India. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what values actually are.
Mm,
And as psychologists, as mental health clinicians, we might be engaging with this work a lot more than other people out there in the community who don't have to sit and do values exercises, who don't have to read, ACT textbooks. So they're not really sitting and figuring out what are my top three values.
mm,
They might
mm,
not be doing CPD in this area. So it's really hard for a lot of people to recognize what's the difference between my values versus my cultural beliefs
mm,
versus my personal preferences.
mm,
You know, most people don't have the time, and if they don't have spare time or spare space to actually sit and do all these exercises. But what makes it even more complex is that a lot of our values are actually strengthened by cultural mores and cultural belief systems as well. Whether we value being with other people, whether we value respect for other community people or elders in the community, whether we value things like harmony and warmth, a lot of these things are strengthened by certain cultures. And that kind of flows out through a person's behaviors, in
mm,
their attitudes towards other people, in their attitudes towards themselves,
mm,
how they speak, how they interact with other people. And those are the things that we see on the outside. That's how we gauge what another person values. We look at their behaviors, we look at how we feel around them, we look at what they're talking about, what they express, how they express themselves. And it can all get really confusing. So going back to where we started, yes, it's an incredibly difficult process and very, very layered process as well. And
mm.
there's also this, I think another aspect that doesn't get talked about is how much migration happens by choice versus how much of it is forced.
Tell me more about that. I actually myself haven't thought about it before, reflected on it at all. Yeah.
For a lot of people, when you say new migrant, they think of
Mm,
someone who's an economic migrant. who has
mm,
come here, migrated by choice.
mm,
So I'm economic migrant. I migrated here by choice. So I was
mm,
able to do the whole process online through the Department of Home Affairs Immigration, all of that. I filled out all my forms myself. I had the financial privilege to be able to pay the fees required to do all of those processes. I was able to buy my own plane ticket. I already had degrees and work experience that were valued in Australia. And so I got that visa. I was able to come here. I was able to go to work and find a job and find friends and do things. A lot of people think that's what migration looks like for everyone, and it's not. And some people are actually displaced
mm,
in their home countries,
mm.
either due to ethnic tension, civil war, economic reasons as well, safety reasons, and they have to come here because they're seeking asylum away from a place where they're actually unsafe or where they're persecuted. That's another pathway for a lot of people to migrate. And as you know, Australia doesn't have a great track record with accepting people who have come here as asylum seekers. Unfortunately, that's a reality of where we live. There's also this really tricky, hidden kind of migration that I have seen so many times in working with communities, working with my clients, is the apparent migrant by choice who did not have much choice in their migration, people who were young children when they migrated, who came along because they didn't have much say as, young people without, who were probably dependent on their parents. Their parents are migrated, and so they just came along and got plonked in Australia and just had to figure it out and survive. People who are forced into marriage or who
Mm.
enter arranged marriages or who enter visa arrangements and come here, and for all intents and purposes externally they look like they migrated by choice, or they might seem like they have agency in the process. But when we peel back the layers, how much agency does, let's say for example, and not very, a person who's gone to high school in India from a really rural area, who entered an arranged marriage with a person she doesn't even know, with a man she wouldn't even have known before, who has just arrived here as a new migrant. How much choice did she actually have in that process? Why do we expect a person who has migrated through that process to automatically feel grateful that she's migrated to, what is a country that is more progressive, or a Western country? Um, why is that person not allowed to have doubts and resentment about the fact
Yeah, that's a big
that,
one. Yeah,
yeah, they have
that's true.
left behind a country where they were living their life? And what is the support available to a person who feels displaced but does not appear to have been displaced? And do they know that they're able to label these things? They're allowed to verbalize these things and seek support.
I think that's a good one because I think the way you describe why do we expect them not to have resentment and negative emotions, and that's a big one. I think that's not only present in the society here, but even the where they come from, like that expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you moved to Australia, you should be so
Mm.
grateful, that, and that's just, yeah, it would be a really difficult process. That forced displacement in that scenario.
Yes, and sometimes, guess what? They're not able to come and find work that's fulfilling
Mhm.
for them here, or they're in an unfulfilling relationship and they know nobody else, or they're isolated on purpose, and they're unable to form any fulfilling friendships or relationships on the outside. They don't have any contact with their social networks or families back home, wherever they came from. They don't have access to income or economic resources, and they don't even know that mental health resources exist. And then there's also the very real risk of visa-based abuse
Yeah, oh,
happening
yeah.
to a lot of people who come in these circumstances. So it's not as simple as just being culturally responsive as a clinician working in this space, but it is also about being culturally humble and willing to learn that there are experiences outside your own experience that your clients have, that people out there in the community have. And you have to be, and that's for me, that's the crux of culturally affirming and responsive therapy, that you have to be willing to admit that you do not know everything, and that just because you're a brown person does not mean you're automatically culturally responsive.
That's so good. Yep, absolutely right. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah, absolutely. Because I've observed this even in my practice. If I'm seeing someone from my culture, there's so many things I don't understand just based on which generation they're from.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think just admitting, yeah, and just, it feels like a burden off your chest because you don't have to know it all, and that's
Exactly.
best practice. The willingness to learn. Um, and I guess that's one thing I want to speak with you moving forward about the psychologists that are here, that are not
Mm.
trained, because I wasn't trained about this in university in the depth that it could have been.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very important that we spread as much awareness as possible so that even the psychologists who are not from a background of color, they it's okay not to know, but it's okay to be curious about it, I guess.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's okay to ask. And just like we would say, that approach will not work for all clients.
Exactly.
Just like all modalities of therapy will not work for all
Exactly right.
clients, but it helps you build that therapeutic relationship. And it, for me, that flattening of the power dynamic between therapist and client is extremely valuable. That is
Mhm.
something that I work very hard to do when I'm working with clients, when I'm working with communities.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, communities see you as the expert.
Mhm.
They might not have come across a mental health professional or a medical professional or a professional of standing in that particular area of expertise from their community who
Yeah.
looks like them, who sounds like them, who has, who speaks the same language as them. So it sometimes becomes that onus of expertise is placed on you without you
Yeah.
asking for it. And it's good to normalize for our communities as well that actually we don't have all the answers, but we
Yeah.
can figure them out together.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not there to just fix you. Yeah, it's
Yes,
not it's not a broken arm.
yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
that's, there's a lot of talk about how um, multicultural people, multicultural communities actually don't access professional mental health support in Australia. And I find that to be a very one dimensional argument.
Mm-hmm.
What you're not understanding when you make that statement is that for a lot of multicultural communities, like I said earlier, they might not even be aware that professional support is an actual thing, that therapy is an actual thing they can go to, that a therapist is a professional they can go and talk to. But apart from that, in a lot of communities, help seeking does not look like the highly individualized process of going to therapy that is normalized in white Western cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Help seeking looks like talking to your parents or aunties and uncles. Help seeking looks like going over to your friend's house and, eating a homemade meal there. Help
Mm-hmm.
seeking looks like staying within your community and working towards a community based goal rather
Mm-hmm.
than an individualistic goal. So even the process of help seeking is not the same. They might not even know that this process exists. So before we make those kind of statements that, oh, well, Indian people never come to therapy or Asian Australians never show up in therapy, these are things that we should actually be aware of, that from a policy perspective, from a systemic perspective, what are we missing out on?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And I think that's where you're right. It's because there's a difference in the type of culture. It's individualistic versus collectivistic culture.
Mm,
And one thing I've sort of started observing is that when I'm even in working with clients, some it's just working with people around them, the social support is it's just so helpful. You're not working with the client just isolated in that, as one person. It's always the dynamic. And it's not just, oh, you have symptoms, we'll do CBT and you're good to go. It's not like that. It's everything. It's the environment, right?
Absolutely, yes. And a lot of my colleagues would be